Imagine standing in a bustling market square, maybe somewhere you know, maybe somewhere totally new. Now picture every single face you see being completely distinct, telling a unique story just through their features. Not just small variations, but like a really vibrant, astonishing tapestry of human appearance. That's the kind of incredible diversity we're diving into today. This deep dive is all about Ecuador. It's a relatively small country in South America, right? Only about 18 million people, but physically, it's one of the most diverse nations on the entire continent. Our mission really is to unpack why. Why do Ecuadorians look so astonishingly different from each other? We want to get beyond just, surface looks. We'll explore that fascinating mixed geography, history, ancestry that shaped how people look. The idea is to move past stereotypes, and we'll truly appreciate this living mosaic of faces that call Ecuador home. So where do we even start trying to unravel all this variety? Does the land itself kind of set the stage?
Oh, absolutely. You've hit it right there. The sheer geographical diversity is the starting point. It immediately sets the scene. Ecuador isn't just one place, It's practically four distinct geographical worlds packed into one small country. And these regions, they've profoundly shaped the people living there over, well, millennia.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. How exactly does the land, the Andes, the coast, the Amazon, how does that start to write the story of how people look in Ecuador? What's the first chapter?
Well, the country is famously divided into these four main zones. You've got the Sierra, that's the Andes highlands, really majestic. Then the Costa, the coastal lowlands along the Pacific. After that, the Amazon region, often called the Oriente, which covers a big chunk of the east. And then, totally unique, the Galapagos Islands, way out in the ocean. And each of these environments, they've fostered really specific human adaptations and created incredibly diverse mixes of people over centuries.
So we're talking about direct, visible adaptations. Could someone who doesn't know Ecuador actually mistake people from different regions for totally different nationalities just based on how they look?
Honestly, it's entirely possible the differences can be that pronounced. Take the Sierra, for example. The indigenous groups there, Quechua, Otavalo, Cañari, they adapted to the high altitudes. So you often see shorter statures, maybe more barrel-shaped chests, which helps with breathing thinner air, and often strong, quite defined cheekbones. But then you travel down to the Costa, the coast, and it's a whole different picture.
Right.
That area is largely dominated by mestizo and Afro-Ecuadorian communities, and that reflects centuries of complex mixing between the Spanish colonizers, Africans brought over, sadly, during colonial times, and the indigenous peoples who lived along the coast. Their features often lean towards being taller, maybe leaner builds compared to the highlands.
And the Amazon, that always feels like a completely separate world. How does that show up in the people?
Exactly. It is distinct. In the Amazon, you find groups like the Shuar, the Huarani, the Akwar. They developed physical traits really suited for rainforest life. So you might see typically copper-brown skin tones, generally shorter builds, maybe more compact, and specific facial characteristics that set them apart, often very straight, dark hair, too. And then the Galapagos geographically isolated, of course, but today it's this fascinating mix of more recent migrants from all over the mainland. So it's like a mini Ecuador in terms of diversity. This geographical layering, it's really the fundamental reason why you just can't pin down one single Ecuadorian look. It's almost like four ecosystems bringing four distinct sort of human types, all within one border.
Wow. Okay, so if geography is chapter 1, then maybe skin tone is chapter 2.
Yeah.
Etched onto people's faces, telling this ongoing story of Ecuador's heritage. It sounds like a spectrum that tells a really powerful, sometimes difficult story.
Absolutely. It's more than just a visual detail. The spectrum of skin tones is deeply, deeply tied into social reality in Ecuador. Scientists, census data, they've looked at this closely, and it shows Ecuadorians span this truly wide range of skin tones. And that has, well, significant implications that go way beyond just appearance. It can be a visible marker of an invisible social landscape, if you like.
Can you paint a picture of that spectrum for us?
Yeah.
What does the data actually show, and what does it mean for how people, live their lives in Ecuador?
Sure. So census data generally reveals that about 71% of Ecuadorians identify as mestizo. That term signifies a blend of Spanish and indigenous ancestry, the most common identity. Then you have about 7% identifying as indigenous, another 7% as Afro-Ecuadorian, and roughly 6% as white. There are also smaller but significant groups like the Montubio. They're a distinct cultural group, often linked with rural life, especially cattle ranching on the coast. So, mestizos. They often show tan to light brown skin tones, that direct reflection of the Spanish indigenous mix. Indigenous communities, especially up in the Sierra, typically have darker, sort of copper tone skin, which makes sense given centuries of intense sun exposure at high altitudes.
And the Afro-Ecuadorian population, what's the
Yeah.
story their skin tones tell about their specific heritage?
Right. So Afro-Ecuadorians, who are mainly concentrated in places like Esmeraldas province on the northern coast,
Yeah.
and also the Valle del Chota, which is a valley in the northern highlands,
Okay.
they generally display deeper brown to ebony skin tones, as you'd expect given their West and Central African roots. White Ecuadorians, often descendants of Spanish colonists or later European immigrants, tend to have lighter complexions. But here's where the meaning part you asked about comes in. There's quite a bit of social controversy, historically and today, around skin tone in Ecuador. Sociological studies pretty consistently show a stark correlation. Lighter skin has, historically at least, been associated with more privilege, more access to power, whereas darker-skinned indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorian groups often continue to face systemic discrimination. And that impacts everything: education, jobs, social mobility. It's a deeply rooted issue that definitely still shapes daily life for many.
That's a really powerful point. It's definitely not just about looks then. And it's not just the broad strokes like skin tone, is it?
Yeah.
The smaller details, eye color, hair texture, they start to whisper these stories of generations mixing too.
They absolutely do. When you connect these sort of finer details to the big picture of ancestral mixing, they become this fascinating living proof of Ecuador's incredibly diverse heritage. Take eye color, for instance. Most Ecuadorians, maybe 85 to 90%, have dark brown eyes. That strongly reflects the predominant indigenous and African ancestry. It's definitely the most common trait you'll see.
But I have heard, actually, that there's a surprising amount of lighter eye colors too. Does that sort of suggest that the idea of pure ancestry is, well, mostly a myth, even in communities that seem quite similar?
That's a really sharp question. And
Yeah.
yeah, basically, European influence definitely introduced variation. So you find around 10 to 12% of Ecuadorians have lighter eye colors: hazel, green, sometimes blue. You see these most often in the Sierra, among mestizo and white families, and also in some coastal cities where there were maybe larger groups of European descendants. But what's really interesting is that you sometimes see lighter eyes pop up even within indigenous communities. That's because of centuries of admixture, of mixing.
Right.
So, a child with distinctly indigenous features like copper skin, but also having green eyes, it might seem surprising to an outsider, but it's actually more common than many people realize. It just shows how deep that blending goes back.
And hair.
Yeah.
Does that follow a similar pattern of mixed heritage showing through?
It totally does. Hair textures in Ecuador are another beautiful reflection of this mixed ancestry. Straight, thick black hair that's very dominant among indigenous and many mestizo populations. You'll often see it worn long or in traditional braids and styles. Then you have wavy and dark brown hair appearing frequently in mestizo and white families, kind of a blend of different genetic inputs. And of course, Afro-Ecuadorians contribute those really distinctive, tightly coiled and curly textures. These are often worn naturally or in incredibly intricate braids or styled in ways that really celebrate their heritage. It adds another whole layer of visual and cultural richness.
What about facial features themselves? Are they also a clear blend of these different ancestral lines?
Yes, facial features are just as diverse and tell a very similar story. Indigenous Ecuadorians often have characteristically broad cheekbones, maybe distinct almond-shaped eyes, sometimes more rounded facial structures. Afro-Ecuadorians tend to show features like fuller lips and broader noses, reflecting their African heritage. European descended groups might display narrower features, lighter tones overall. And mestizos, being the majority, well, they carry this fascinating blend of all these traits. They really span the entire spectrum. It's truly like reading the country's layered history right there on people's faces.
And it's not just the face, is it? The whole body seems to reflect these deep influences. Height and build, they tell another part of Ecuador's incredible, diverse story.
Yeah, it's quite striking how both genetic adaptation and environmental factors, particularly nutrition, play such a big role in physical stature. On average, an Ecuadorian man is about 5'6". That's around 167 centimeters. The average woman is about 5'2" or 158 centimeters. Now, those averages are pretty close to norms in the region, but within Ecuador, there's significant variation depending on ancestry and, crucially, where people live, the geography.
So with those clear regional differences in height, how does something like nutrition then overlay onto that? Does it affect the bigger picture of the nation's average height and maybe overall health?
That's where the The human story really intersects with the genetics. Highland indigenous groups, for instance, they're often shorter and stockier. That's partly an adaptation to the cold Andean climate, but also to the high altitude itself. A more compact build can actually be advantageous. But then, down on the coast, mestizos and Afro-Ecuadorians tend, on average, to be taller and maybe leaner. That reflects influences from both their African and European ancestry. And if you go into the Amazon, the indigenous groups there are generally shorter again, with more compact builds that are well suited for survival in that dense rainforest environment. But nutrition, yes, it significantly overlays all of this. UNICEF reports that about 27% of Ecuadorian children under 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition. That's actually one of the highest rates in South America.
Wow, 27%. That's huge.
It is, and it has real long-term effects on average height, of course, but also on overall health across the population. It impacts not just individuals, but things like national productivity, well-being. However, it's not static. It's a dynamic situation. Younger generations, especially in urban areas, are showing increasing average height. That's likely due to better diets, improved access to nutrition. So while genetics might set a kind of baseline, environmental factors like food security clearly have a profound and evolving impact.
Okay, we've talked about the genetic blueprint, the environmental adaptations. But these aren't just abstract traits, are they? They're living histories, carried by really vibrant communities. Can you maybe take us into the heart of some of Ecuador's distinct groups? Give us a feel for their legacy.
That's such a crucial point. These features belong to distinct communities that have truly shaped the soul of Ecuador. And it forces us, I think, to acknowledge and celebrate these diverse identities, especially given the historical challenges many have faced. Let's start with indigenous identity and legacy. Indigenous Ecuadorians are incredibly visible in the country's culture and population. Groups like the Otavalo, for instance, are famous worldwide for their vibrant markets, their traditional music.
Textiles too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Their beautiful textiles are like walking works of art. They immediately tell a story of resilience and tradition. The Quichua are another prominent group. You'll see them maintaining their traditional clothing, their languages, right across the Andean highlands.
They've faced some pretty significant hurdles over time, though, haven't they? Despite contributing so much.
Yeah. They absolutely have. Their physical features, that coppery skin, the dark almond eyes, strong builds, they're really emblematic of Andean identity. But despite this deep cultural visibility, indigenous communities have historically faced and still face discrimination and underrepresentation. Even though over 1.1 million people identify as indigenous, their presence in, say, national politics or media or even just major urban centers is often overshadowed by the dominant mestizo narrative. So it creates this ongoing challenge for full recognition, for land rights, for equality, even today.
And what about the Afro-Ecuadorian presence? They've also left such a clear mark on the nation's identity.
Afro-Ecuadorians are another absolutely vital piece of this mosaic. They're mainly concentrated in Esmeraldas province, up on the coast, and also in the Valle do Chota, that's a specific valley in the northern highlands. We're talking about a population of around 1.2 million people. Their features the dark skin, the distinctive curly and coiled hair, often taller builds. They powerfully reflect their African ancestry, which is primarily from West and Central Africa. And their cultural impact. It's profound. They've deeply shaped national culture. Think of the incredible musical traditions like the marimba music from Esmeraldas or the really energetic bamba rhythms from the Chota Valley, along with unique dance styles.
And sports, too, I hear.
Oh, definitely sports.
Yeah.
Especially football, soccer, Afro-Ecuadorians absolutely dominate. Many of Ecuador's top international players come from these regions. They're national heroes, icons.
But despite that huge cultural impact, those successes, they also face significant challenges, don't they, similar to indigenous groups?
Unfortunately, yes. Despite their deep contributions and achievements, Afro-Ecuadorians face significantly higher poverty rates. Statistics show about 50% live below the poverty line.
50%. Compared to what nationally?
Compared to a national average of around 25%, so double. This stark economic inequality, it fuels ongoing debates about representation, recognition, systemic racism. It really highlights the urgent need for continued efforts towards social justice and, truly equitable opportunities within the country.
So, okay, we've explored all this incredible variation, geography, ancestry, skin tone features, even stature and nutrition. What does all this mean for the idea of a typical Ecuadorian look? It sounds like asking that question would spark a lot of disagreement.
You're hitting on a really core tension point there. It's fascinating, actually, how different groups within Ecuador view themselves, or perhaps want to be viewed as embodying the national identity. It highlights these deeper complexities around race, class, and national pride. There really isn't a national consensus on a typical look. The very question is quite controversial.
How do those different viewpoints play out? Why is it so hard to define?
Well, some people argue that mestizos, with their characteristic tan skin, straight black hair, brown eyes, best represent the typical Ecuadorians simply because they are the demographic majority. They might see themselves as the synthesis, the blend that defines the nation.
Oh, yeah, it's one view.
Others, though, argue quite vehemently that indigenous groups truly embody Ecuador's ancient ancestry and its deepest cultural roots. They'd say their features are the most authentic representation of the land and its history. And then Afro-Ecuadorians, they rightly highlight their undeniable role in shaping the national identity through huge contributions, music, food, sport, as we mentioned. They argue their look is just as Ecuadorian and absolutely indispensable to the national fabric. So this clash of viewpoints, it really reflects an ongoing struggle for visibility, for recognition, for whose story gets told as the Ecuadorian story.
And how does the outside world perceive Ecuador? Does that add another layer to this whole thing?
It absolutely does. And often the external perception simplifies or even erases a lot of this internal diversity. Think about tourism ads, for example. They frequently tend to portray lighter-skinned mestizos. That often sidelines indigenous and Afro-descended faces from the image that's presented to the world.
Yeah, I can picture.
And internationally, sometimes Ecuadorians get stereotyped as looking, like Peruvians or Bolivians, which, okay, might hold some truth for parts of the Andean region given shared ancestry.
Right.
But that completely erases the country's incredibly rich coastal diversity, the Afro-descended populations. It ignores huge parts of the picture. So this external, often simplified view, it really mirrors those deeper tensions about race, class, and national pride happening within Ecuador itself.
So looking ahead then, what's next for this incredible diversity? Is Ecuador kind of blending into something more uniform, or is this vibrant mosaic just going to keep evolving?
That's the really interesting question, isn't it? If we connect this to the bigger picture, demographers actually predict continued and even evolving diversity in Ecuador. It seems to be more a story of resilience and ongoing cultural exchange rather than, say, homogenization into one single look. We're actually seeing new influences coming into the mix, too.
New influences.
Yeah.
Like new communities adding to this already complex picture.
Yes, absolutely. Migration, for instance. People coming from neighboring countries like Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, that's adding even more new genetic threads, new cultural influences into Ecuador's population. And crucially, intermarriage between the existing groups, mestizo, indigenous, Afro-descended populations that's increasingly common. It's creating even more wonderfully blended appearances, new combinations of features.
So identities aren't just being lost in the blend. It almost sounds like they're being revitalized in some ways.
Precisely. It's not necessarily erasure. While blending happens, traditional identities are also finding new strength and visibility. Indigenous groups, for example, are actively working to revive their languages, their traditions, ensuring their distinct features and identities remain visible and strong. You see that through education, cultural festivals, political movements. Similarly, Afro-Ecuadorians are gaining much more recognition now in national politics and sports, as we said. They're actively pushing for greater equality and representation, which really solidifies their place in the national story. In fact, some scientists even suggest that Ecuador's rich genetic diversity is a huge asset. It offers a kind of built-in resilience against disease, maybe, and a remarkable adaptability that could be incredibly beneficial for future generations, especially, in a changing world. It's truly dynamic, an ever-evolving mosaic, not something static at all.
So what makes Ecuador's people look so astonishingly different? Well, it's this epic ongoing story, isn't it? It's the Andes Mountains, the Pacific Coast, the Amazon rainforest all colliding. It's indigenous endurance, it's African resilience, it's European colonization, and centuries upon centuries of blending, all written profoundly on the faces of its people. So next time you think of Ecuador, try not to picture just one face. Instead, imagine this vibrant mosaic bronze, tan, dark, fair, curly-haired, straight-haired, brown-eyed, hazel-eyed, all uniquely Ecuadorian, all waving the same flag. It's just such a powerful reminder, I think, that true beauty, true strength, it's so often found in difference, not in uniformity. And if this deep dive into Ecuador's incredible human diversity maybe gave you a new perspective, maybe think about what other assumptions you might hold about places, about people around the world, because usually when you look closer, the world is always way more complex and frankly more beautiful than you first imagined.